The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai hoki mai kia The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Brodie Kane, who maybe the most famous person to ever be on this podcast, certainly up there. She has worked on 7 Sharp, on Breakfast, on Fair Go. She came second on Dancing with the Stars recently, and we touch on that. She's basically been a fixture in some of our most popular and enduring television shows for a long period of time. And yet, the reason I'm here to talk to her is not about any of that, really. It's about the fact that she, 2 years ago, founded Brodie Kane Media, which is, it's a few different things. It's a vehicle for her as a speaker and her social media presence. But the core of it is a nascent podcast network, which is sort of headlined by the Girls Uninterrupted, her flagship podcast, and actually one of the biggest by numbers in the country. And as she tells us, that came out of a very abrupt redundancy that happened just as we were heading into lockdown, a very scary time for media. And I think for a lot of people that the response to that would have been to either take whatever you could get as far as a job in media went, or to find a new trade. And she's discussed that there are some out there for her, but she didn't. She started something, and she's poured herself into it. And the podcasting is obviously, if you listen to this, you naturally know what podcasts are, and I'm assuming you probably quite like them. People who listen to podcasts are passionate fans of the medium. I've never seen data on this. I'd really quite like to know, but it's my favourite medium of all the different forms of media I consume. Maybe touch and go with newsletters, but I'd say podcast would edge it because of the intimacy, because of it just feels like it's you and the host. And Brodie clearly feels that way too. And really this is a conversation about how you take that sort of passion and the connection with audience and build a business out of it. And I don't think any of us can confidently say that we've figured that out yet. I think it's very established overseas, but there has been a bit of a struggle to get that across the line here with some, that there's a lot of interest and there's a lot happening there, but it's not quite finished. And that's actually what's most interesting about it, that it's just all kind of unwritten. So we talk about the business side of it. We talk about her traditional media career and how it's informed us, and how actually, given the option, she'd probably stay with what she's doing still. I just really, really like her as a public media figure. She feels, I'm not surprised that she succeeded in podcasting, because she is very unfiltered, and she's sort of a natural and instinctive operator in a space that, public figures on her level are often, quite deliberate and relatively closed off in terms of how they sort of share themselves. But she's always been very available, and you saw that in the way that she talked about her abortion in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, for example. And that, I think, has largely driven her success, and is why Brodie Kane Media, I think, has a real shot at becoming one of the emblematic independent podcast providers in this country. So this is Brodie Kane on The Fold. Kia ora, Brodie, and welcome to The Fold.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honour.
Oh, it's so exciting. We have been trying to do this for a while. I think last time you were mid dancing, and now you've recovered from it. I'm curious, because you're effectively like an endurance athlete, like just along with everything else. But dancing is its own thing. Tell me what the process of doing that show was like physically, and the sort of emotional kind of public journey of it all.
It was nothing like I've ever experienced, and I definitely went into it knowing that I was really fit actually, because I just finished training for the Coast to Coast, which didn't end up happening, but me and a group kind of did our own version anyway. So physically I was like, cool, I know that actually I'm in the greatest shape of my life. I don't think anything can prepare you for the brain fry, the exhausting nature of being completely out of your comfort zone for a really extended period of time, and being that whole experience felt like I was hardly ever in control of my emotions. You know, like you were like, you know, I often referred to Tantrum Tuesday because that was after the huge emotional toll of the live shows of the massive weekend, and then you're like, okay, well last week you learnt 2 dances, so why not this Tuesday we not have a tantrum and panic about learning 2 dances? But no, they happened every Tuesday, so you just couldn't help but just be completely overwhelmed at this task that you had ahead of you. And then you were like, don't be upset, don't cry, because this is an amazing opportunity and it's just a bloody TV show. But so you went through all of that, and then you're like, I love this is amazing. And then all over again and around, you know. So it was remarkable. It was a remarkable experience, and we were very, very lucky to have such a wonderful cast this year who've all become pretty close. So if you ask me if I'd do it again tomorrow, yes, I would do it again tomorrow. It was just, and I learned to dance and I got second. So it was incredible.
And another incredible aspect of it was the way that your mum went from being a sort of a bit part in one of the videos to this, like, I don't know how you describe her. She's like sort of in part your, like, this kind of bouncer. Like she was there, like, you could feel her presence in the audience when the judges were making their decisions. Well,
she basically had her own subplot going, didn't she?
Yeah, that's a much more concise way of putting it. How's she finding how did she find the whole experience of having you literally judged in public while she sort of sat there watching? And
well, she's always been like, she has been to, you know, probably every single event or race or anything I have participated in, she has been there. So she is like, honestly, if you're ever after some sort of support crew for anything, she is your gal. Like, she was my support crew for, like, she's there for all my marathons and coast to coast and that. So I knew that she was an integral part of me. You know, I wanted her to be there, you know. And so, but it became quite intense for her as well, like just the emotions and seeing my emotions and being up there, like, because she came up every weekend. And so she, you know, like, it took over her life too. But she loved it. Like, she loves being part of it. So it was really, really special.
So the thing that's interesting to me is, you know, Dancing with the Stars is now achieved. There must be some invisible marker that when a show becomes kind of iconic in the New Zealand context, but it's hardly the only one that you've been an integral part of. Like, actually earlier this morning I had Jack Tame on the show. You've been on Breakfast with him, but also on Q&A in another capacity. You've been on Fair Go. You've been on Seven Sharp. Like, you had this, and you're still young as hell. Like, you've been basically part of all these kind of big pieces of the New Zealand media furniture, including, you know, hosting broadcast radio. And yet we're not really here to talk about any of that. We're here to talk about you having started your own thing, which most of our celebrities get up each day, and they could do that, and they don't. But you did. Why?
Well, actually, the first part of it, I didn't really have a choice because I was made redundant, and I so obviously I worked at TVNZ for 6 years, and I experienced all those great shows that you mentioned, and then got the opportunity to host a breakfast radio show in Christchurch, and it was quite an interesting decision. And it was like, am I going to leave Auckland and am I going to leave TVNZ? And I really got to a position where I was like, I love radio and I love the longevity that you can have in a radio career. and and so I thought, I will go and do this. And it was on the Hits radio station, and down there they were really looking to grow the audience. And so I was like, people often talk about whether it's a step forward or a sideways step. And I kind of think you've got to just ignore the noise around that. But for me, I was like, well, that's quite a great challenge. I thought, well, I'm home around my family, and I negotiated what I thought was like a great deal. So I was like, all right, well, let's go and give it a crack. And so I was very happy and very settled and enjoying that and working hard. And then we got made redundant so remarkably out of the blue, just on this one day. I mean, we always used to joke. I know that Australian radio can be a lot more ruthless, but we always joke about people getting the white envelope. Literally, you have a bad lot of ratings in Australia and you get past the white envelope. I don't know how true that is. But we turned up to this meeting in the morning after a show and it was like, is that the white envelope? What? And it was so,
that's brutal.
Yeah.
Especially given that you had made this decision to go that way from a path that was going very well, thanks.
Yeah. And so and when I say the white envelope, I mean there's obviously a process and whatnot that you go through, blah, blah,
But you
blah.
knew what was up.
Yeah, I knew it was up. And so it really took me by surprise. And then, of course, as timing would have it, this was a few weeks before COVID really kicked in here. But then, obviously, we went into that lockdown. So, that happened in February. Obviously, March is when we went into lockdown. And then we saw lots of things happen in the media industry, like the radio sport getting gassed, people, the magazines. And it was sort of like, oh my God, it was quite terrifying to think that I don't have a job and I'm also working in an industry where there will be no jobs. And who knows how, at that stage it was like...
It felt like the whole industry was in danger of caving in at that time because no one was going to spend any money advertising to people who were just fundamentally locked at home and terrified.
Yeah, so it was quite weird. And so the first couple of weeks of lockdown were very weird. I did lockdown with Mum. So there was lots of long walks and sort of talks and stuff. But I had ultimately, for some years, I had always thought how wonderful it would be to work for yourself. And I didn't quite know what that would look like, but I always thought how nice it would be to pick and choose what you did. And so I'd obviously already started working on one podcast at the time, which was called Girls on Top, and we rebranded, and that was sort of we were kicking that off, and we rebranded and started in the middle of lockdown. And so then it was like, well, what if I just do that now? What if I give it a crack, and what's the worst that can happen? And so that was sort of, using that time to go, well, okay, let's start Brodie Kane Media. Let's focus on some of the things that you're good at and just sort of see how that goes, essentially.
But it seems like it's gone really well. Just looking, as someone who's done a similar thing, albeit it feels like a lot smaller and took a lot longer to get going. But, you look at the number of brand partnerships, you look at the public-facing metrics, and it must be really validating to have that, I didn't realise the extent to which this was sort of forced upon you, but having made that decision to have the commercial partners come through and also a really substantial, in the context of New Zealand podcast, audience develop, that must be quite gratifying to look back on that 2 years later. Yeah,
and I think it's I've learned some pretty important lessons along the way, and I think it's really important for anyone starting out on their own to realise that you can't just do it on your own. You have to. It's okay to ask people for help, and more often than not, you'll get some great advice. And I remember though in the first few months though, and I think it was still the pressure and feeling because we're so used to traditional forms of media here in New Zealand, you felt like you were like, and this sounds really I guess shallow, but unfortunately, you have to stay relevant in order for people to give a crap about what you're saying. So, there was the panic of I don't have a radio show, I don't have a television show. How do am I still interesting enough for people to want to listen to? And, so that jumped up the activity that I was doing on social media. So Mum and I were doing during lockdown and that, the Joe Bro show, which we talked to different celebrities every night. It was just trying to grow that audience because I could control that. It was if I can keep an audience somewhere, that's where I'll keep it. And
so that was the strategy, to develop the social audience and port that across to a medium which had more commercial potential?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, I was like, okay, I have a relatively strong Instagram following. I have to treat that as my own little TV station. You know what I mean? So it was like, it became more important to be entertaining and sharing myself every day, because I didn't have the show. I didn't have anything else to do it by. And then, but we already did have a loyal following with what's now obviously the Girls Uninterrupted. And so it was like, okay, how do we go by this? But let me be clear. I would say right now that 80 to 85% of the work that I do, I'm not getting paid, or I'm not paying myself. And you would understand that you have a vision and you can see where something is going to go and where you want it to go. But it takes a while. But so that's where, like, and I genuinely love emceeing events and public speaking. And yeah, your social media partnerships as well pay for all of the hours of doing and producing and getting the podcasts off the ground. And one of the reasons I moved back up to Auckland was to then upskill myself into getting more into the commercial side of it. You know, I can edit a podcast, I can produce it, I can help put one together. I'm not a sales rep by nature, but I have to be, you know, so that's where the next sort of challenges lie.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you about that, because it's tremendously complex. Like you come from, you've got this particular background, and then you have to just sort of build out by trial and error and blundering into offices and feeling the fear and doing it anyway and all that corny stuff. You know, to will this thing that is like a figment of your imagination into being. How are you finding that other aspect of it, like beyond the stuff that you know very well how to do, the stuff that you're just absolutely figuring out on the fly?
Well, in some ways it's quite fun, because I think particularly in New Zealand as well, it is still relatively, we're like, in the overall scheme of things, New Zealand's still quite fresh, I guess, in the podcast space. It's really kicking off now because everyone wants a podcast. So it's great to be at that advantage, and you know, and so I feel like there's a plus to it, because New Zealand, I think, will always be a unique market, and we don't necessarily always operate like overseas. So we can kind of make things up as we go along. And I actually said that, I spoke at a podcast panel thing this morning with my agent had organised, and I said we've got a really unique opportunity here in New Zealand, whereby we don't have to do everything like they do in America and put thousands of ads on a podcast. We can sort of create our own rules, but we need you guys to come along with us now and take us seriously. And the reason that is true is because if you look at listenerships of podcasts, it's huge, and the level of engagement is so much more in terms of the people that are listening. So I feel like where it is right now is at a tipping point, because, you know, if you think about television, radio and print, people are used to how they've paid for their advertising and know what they're getting and have done so for years. It's dipping the toes into something that's new. So you're trying to take them along with you, and it's really exciting. Am I still learning? Yes. Have I got, I'm about to sort of step into a different kind of realm of advertising, and I'm like, okay, and I'm just giving everything a crack, and we'll just see how that goes.
And that's I think that's where we all are on some level. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you was because, you know, Jane and Tahir and myself have been sort of really working on the Spin-Off Podcast Network, you know, had similar qualities. Like, you know, we knew we had audience for some of our existing properties. We were massive consumers of podcasts, and we knew, you know, the feedback you get is incredible, and it's, you know, both from, you know, big audiences in their own right, but also the different kinds of people and the way they engage with it. You're like, this is a fantastic medium, and yet because so much spend goes through big media agencies, which can quite often just be, they're not hostage to, but it is easier to do the thing that you were doing yesterday tomorrow, and you're asking them to learn something new and value something new. But you know, it's interesting that to hear you talk about a tipping point, because I think that's true, but we do struggle a little bit, and I'd be interested to get your perspective on this, is that quite often brands will want to make their own podcast, and then they have to build podcast audience from scratch, which as we know, is incredibly difficult, whereas having some way of working with an existing podcast with a big audience that sort of fits with what they're doing is a far more cost-efficient way that actually naturally fits the format. What has been your experience of partnering with organisations in that podcast space?
Yeah, well, as I sort of alluded to before, it's the very fashionable item at the moment. And the reality is anyone can buy a microphone and start a podcast, which is a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Very entry,
right,
quite
right.
low.
You know, and I think that I think it is great, but they're hard work, and so I think I'm definitely seeing a correlation to, like, I guess the influencer space sort of morphing into the podcast space. And you know what? That's fine. Let that be that. Let that be that. But what I think happens is there tends to be this kind of turn your nose up at that kind of at these, because it's new and people don't know enough and it's not traditional. So I feel like sometimes we get a bit like that with things. If I liken it to when 7 Sharp started and we all worked on the show, and the aim of it was to be new and offer up, I guess, news and current affairs in an entertaining way. And by gosh, that went down initially like a cup of cold sick, because everyone was like, everyone was angry that you'd taken this, huge show off telly, and you'd put something else on, and people were showing their personality, and it didn't work for people. That people didn't like the change.
People claim to want to like new things and want innovation, but there's a much more powerful urge to resist it or to complain about it, particularly when something is finding its feet. And that might well be something that's playing into this, right?
Well, but then I think what I think is happening is that's more people, dare I say it, from the older generation who are still making the decisions around sponsorship, or who work in, if you think about, let's just say a News Talk ZB audience, and the people that work for it are of a particular age. But what I think's happened is there's a massive chunk of the population who have been ignored. And so that's why you've got things like Netflix and Neon and all these, and then your podcasts. People have never had more access and never more choice than now. And so I learned pretty quickly on 7 Sharp that, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to try and change, and what will be will be. If you don't catch up or keep up with change, you're going to get left behind. And I actually genuinely think that. And I feel like there is often an attitude of snobbery to things like change. Now, I'll give you an example of what I really struggle with, but I'm like, if I don't keep trying, I won't keep up. And that's TikTok. So I look at TikTok and I'm still like, some days it just hurts my soul, my creative soul. But other days I'm like, well, actually, if I set up a Girls Uninterrupted TikTok page and we can put up funny little TikToks, that's a really easy way to try and grow new audience. So it can work for you. So it's like trying to realise that things are evolving and moving very, very quickly. And if you don't change with them, you will get left behind. So I feel like I'm hoping that in the podcast space, people are realising that actually it is a valid space. It's a very wonderful form of medium, and that it's here to stay, So jump on,
Couldn't agree more. Transparently, for transparently self-interested reasons, but also because I genuinely believe in this format. It's probably the one that I listen to, probably the media that I consume the most and enjoy the most. And I think that's true of a lot more people than we give it credit for. The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market. the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
Let's talk about the Girls Uninterrupted, because I get quite annoyed. I'm not sure if you do, about the extent to which, we had the New Zealand Podcast Awards a few months ago, and it was dominated by radio, which is just stuff that was broadcast on air and has been cut up to put into a podcast stream. Which, to my mind, that actually isn't what a podcast is. Like it's it's digital audio delivered through the same channels, but its values, its shape, its format is all dictated by its core format. And this is a second.
Well, it was a highlights reel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And fair play, people like to listen to it, but I think the podcast audience is different and probably doesn't necessarily gravitate towards that. That's probably a disintermediated radio audience that is consuming that. So setting those audiences aside, and probably even including them, the Girls Uninterrupted is a very, very big podcast in the New Zealand context. What's it about, and what do you think has driven its growth? Because it could theoretically have be something that came out of traditional media, and I suppose it has some relationship to that. But fundamentally, it feels naturally a podcast, and it feels naturally an independent podcast.
Well, I guess what's great about it is you've got. I feel like it definitely has evolved as we have. So it's three women navigating life and talking about, sometimes we're being smart and talking about smart things, and sometimes talking about utterly, Love Island, which I'm obsessed by. So it's like, it's a space that's okay to be whatever it needs to be. But also I think, why it is a podcast, of course, is because there's obviously stuff on it that you're not allowed. Well, I don't know whether you're allowed to, but where you don't just talk about on the radio or
we could
on
talk
television.
Right now, and I'd quite like to, about what you thought of Andrew's behaviour during Casa Amor, which you can't really do in other formats. But
No.
I really want to know what the way that he kind of claimed to have been mugged, but I think ultimately mugged himself.
To be honest, that relationship's been doomed from day one. He liked her. He's always liked her more than she's liked him. I think she's got real insecurity issues, though, and I think she was flawed in terms of doubting their relationship and sort of looking for validation elsewhere. So that the seeds of doubt were planted too early for both of them. And then what he did when she was away was just an ultimate silly boy rebound, hot-headed,
I quite enjoyed the way that Coco just completely ripped the metaphorical sheets off. Literally what happened.
Yeah, and so for a moment I felt a bit sorry for him earlier than that, because I felt like he really, really liked Tash. But no, it
feels hella doomed now.
It's doomed.
Anyway, that's why podcasts are good. Even if you didn't like that, because you have the right to be digressive in a way that you can't in the tight format of commercial radio. Like it just doesn't naturally allow for it. So you took the pod on tour, was it last year before?
Year before, 2020.
What did you find? Because pods attract a particular type of fan that I think is that's almost where you feel the intensity and the intimacy of the relationship in a different way to the kind of big mass audience of more tightly controlled media products.
Well, you're their friends.
Yeah.
You're there. There's that hilarious meme that always does the rounds, which is a chick sitting next to a poster, looking at the poster of the other two chicks going, this is what it feels like to be in a podcast. And so, but I feel like you can have authenticity in a way that you can't on the traditional forms. You can bare your soul. You can, you look at Caitlin, people have come along Caitlin's journey from deciding to leave radio and become a nurse. So you're following a cycle and your level of, relatability when you're just navigating your life with them, I think is probably what's been so good about it. And look, as I say, it's probably, I don't necessarily think it's changed, but we have changed. So it literally has grown with us and how our lives have changed. But, I feel like you meet, on that tour, you meet a whole bunch of people who adore being part of a community with you. And I feel like we never underestimate a group getting together as well and having the same, goals and aspirations, or even just, being together is a really, really powerful thing. And so we had a few girls that were like, oh, I don't have anyone to go with. It's like, come along. Like, that's how you'll meet new friends. So it's this, as cliche as it sounds, it is actually a community, and you trust them. So it's a more intimate space where you actually trust them. So, we've actually talked about it a couple of times now, but, when the last time I did it was actually last week. We've talked about, like hemorrhoids, and you're like, oh gosh, are we going to go there? It's so, is there anything we leave at home? And it's like, no, not really. But then you'll get, we got 5 or 6 messages just saying, thank you. Thank you. Like, when you ever have anything like that, you always feel like gross and yuck, but you girls normalising it is amazing, So it is, you've got to remember that is the simplicity of it is actually probably the best part of it.
I mean, that to me is also a big part of what has made you this quite singular presence in our media, because I think, if we think about the media as we grew up with, the notion of the celebrity was a particular type of person. They were very well controlled. They said the right thing in the right place, or even if they were a bit outrageous, it was in a very kind of controlled way. And I think about the way that you were on dancing, or that you the way that you responded to the abortion protest. There seems to be that you just try and be an authentic self. And I think that's probably what has made people gravitate towards you, because you feel qualitatively different to a more controlled and kind of airbrushed celebrity. And that, again, lends itself to podcasting as a medium, because there isn't really anywhere to hide in it. Or it succeeds much more if the audience feel like they can relate to the vision of you that you present.
And I think that you're right. I feel like since going out and sort of being my own boss, and that you are able to allow yourself to be absolutely you, and no one's using you, which is great. So there's this feeling of freedom, and it's really, really nice. And, I've learned a lot from my mum over the years. She's a very strong woman. She's had, some quite high-profile jobs in terms of local government, and she's always in the paper for the headline because she's always not afraid to say what she believes or thinks. But over the years, and things obviously have changed a little bit now, but, she'd get a lot of backlash from that, because it was like, oh, who's this stroppy woman? Or, oh, she's, you're always outspoken. Just when you're speaking, like that classic term is problematic. But I think, I think probably being independent for a while and sort of watching how the world operates, is you just have a different perspective on what's actually important. And so for me, I think that also changes, deciding to talk about my abortion was a big decision, but then again, it felt right. But that was my decision that I didn't have to ask 10 bosses for. I just talked to a couple of my mum and a couple of mates and went, I'm going to do this, what do you think, kind of thing. And so it's a real freedom that I've felt in these past couple of years, which I love.
I was going to touch on that. And I guess that kind of leads me to a good place to to end it is, having experienced being inside the big machines and having succeeded by any standards very well within them, and now having done the really hard thing and set up on your own, do you feel like this is where you're going to stay now? And as hard as it is, that Brodie Kane Media and working this thing out is your future?
Yeah, I'd love to. I would absolutely love that to be the case. Like I would love to carry on in an independent way. And I always sort of said to myself, give it a crack, but you have to be honest when you think that maybe, okay, it's in its current form, it's not working, or maybe you'll do that. And then, like I've always thought I'd be quite a good police officer. So if it sort of doesn't quite work out to how I'd like it, I think I'd do something like that, or maybe jump back into the army or something and, do other things. So I feel like if you have an open mind to having goals and ways you want things to go, but recognising if that's not quite working out, or I guess what's the buzzword, pivoting. But ultimately I feel in a really good space because particularly with the podcasts and what they can also lend to, like events and, web series and things like that, creating things and being your own boss and being able to charge through with those, I'm really excited because the podcast space in New Zealand is in a really good place and it's only going to get better, and I'm ready. So I reckon we're good to go. And as I say, if it turns to shit, I'll just go and be a police officer. I shouldn't say just, but I might go and be an awesome person in the police.
I think you would, but I don't think you're going to get the opportunity because you've got it. Hey, thanks so much for coming on The Fold, Brodie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
The Fold was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with Daylight. It was hosted by Duncan Greive, produced by T.I. He Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to O Media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.